Primitive, Draxel said. These humans rely on speech for communication, an inefficient and crude method. His second-in-command, Sub-Commander Xyler, nodded. They lack any form of advanced telepathic abilities or hive communication networks. Their use of vocal cords to exchange information is archaic. Draxel's lips curled into a sneer as he continued to study the human broadcasts they had intercepted, news reports, military briefings, and casual conversations. All of it was spoken aloud, with visible gestures and emotional expressions. To the Zareth, a species that communicated primarily through thought forms and telepathic links, this seemed primitive, a weakness ripe for exploitation. "Ready the landing team," Draxel ordered. "Let us show these creatures the future of the galaxy." The Zareth had encountered many species during their long reign over the outer sectors of the galaxy, each one eventually bending to their will. They had crushed hive minds, silenced telepaths, and subdued sentient AI. And now, they had turned their attention to humanity, a seemingly fragile, emotional species whose reliance on words would be their undoing. The Zareth shuttle touched down on Earth with an almost silent hum. In the distance, a line of human soldiers stood waiting, clad in dark armor, rifles slung over their shoulders. Draxel stepped out first, his tall, lithe figure casting a long shadow over the alien soil. His piercing gaze swept across the human formation. Not a single human moved. No sound came from their ranks. Behind Draxel, Xyler whispered telepathically, "Do you sense their fear, Commander? They tremble before us." But as Draxel drew closer, something strange caught his attention. The humans remained utterly still. No words passed between them. They didn't flinch or even blink as the Zareth delegation approached. Their faces were unreadable, devoid of any visible emotion, and yet Draxel could sense a quiet intensity in their presence. "They are silent," Xyler noted, his telepathic voice tinged with confusion. "Where is their crude speech? Why do they not engage?" Draxel's brow furrowed. He had expected pleas for peace or even declarations of defiance, but there was nothing, just the unnerving silence. One of the human soldiers, a man with sharp eyes and a rigid posture, stepped forward. His movements were deliberate, controlled. But still, he said nothing. Draxel extended his arm, a gesture of superiority. "I am Commander Draxel of the Zareth. We come to offer you a place within the Zareth Dominion. Resist, and you will be crushed. Comply, and you may survive." The human soldier didn't respond. Instead, his gaze flicked briefly to the right, where another soldier gave a barely perceptible nod. In that instant, Draxel sensed a shift, something intangible but undeniable. The humans had communicated, but not through any means the Zareth could comprehend. Draxel's frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Do you not understand? Speak," he demanded, his voice booming through the tense air. Still, the humans remained silent. Their expressions betrayed nothing, but their eyes. Their eyes were sharp, watchful, as though each man and woman had already spoken volumes through a language invisible to the alien mind. "They're hiding something," Xyler transmitted nervously, casting a wary glance at the human formation. "I cannot sense their thoughts. It's as though they've shut us out." Draxel's patience thinned. He was used to dominating encounters, to reading the fear and confusion of his enemies before they even spoke. But these humans were like stone. Their silence was unnerving, and the subtle glances between them suggested coordination that transcended vocal exchange. "You underestimate us, human," Draxel growled. "If you will not speak, then you will be shown the price of defiance." The human commander, still silent, raised a hand. The simple gesture sent a ripple through the ranks. The soldiers moved, almost in unison, forming a defensive stance as though they had been given direct orders. But no words had been exchanged. No sound had passed between them. The Zareth delegation stepped back, momentarily thrown by the eerie precision of human movements. Draxel's heart began to pound in his chest, a slow realization dawning on him. These humans weren't as primitive as he had assumed. Their silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was something else. Something deeper. Commander, Zyler's telepathic voice trembled. We should retreat. There's more here than meets the eye. But Draxel was not ready to concede. His pride and arrogance would not allow it. And yet, as he stood face to face with the humans, their quiet power unnerved him more than any telepathic force he had encountered before. The first battle between the Zareth and the humans should have been an easy victory. Commander Draxel had mobilized a small strike team, expecting to crush human resistance quickly and decisively. Instead, what unfolded left the alien commander more unnerved than he'd ever admit. The Zareth had approached the human outpost under cover of night, using advanced stealth technology that should have rendered them invisible to human sensors. Draxel had watched from the command ship, expecting chaos the moment his soldiers struck. But the chaos never came. The human defenders responded immediately, as if they had known the exact moment the attack would happen. There had been no warning alarms, no radio transmissions Draxel could intercept. The human forces didn't shout orders or fall into disarray as the attack began. Instead, they moved as one, shifting positions with perfect coordination. Squad leaders made small, barely noticeable gestures, and the rest of the troops followed suit. A subtle hand signal, a nod, a glance. An entire battalion shifted in response, closing off escape routes and laying ambushes for the advancing Zareth forces. Draxel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding on the view screen. How are they communicating? He demanded. There's no sound, no signals. Sub-Commander Zyler, who had been observing from a tactical station, shook his head in disbelief. I don't know, Commander. Our telepathic scans pick up nothing. They're using no technology we can detect. The Zareth strike team, confident in their superiority, continued to push forward. But for every move they made, the humans had a counter. It wasn't just luck. It was strategy, precise, calculated, and impossible to predict. Every time the Zareth adjusted their formation, the humans responded instantly, almost as if they knew the aliens' plans before they were executed. Draxel clenched his fists. His people prided themselves on their telepathic prowess, their ability to dominate through both mental and technological superiority. But these humans, they were different. They weren't just reacting. They were anticipating. On the battlefield below, the human forces closed in on the Zareth. They moved without a sound, communicating in a language that the Zareth couldn't intercept. One human soldier raised a fist, and his entire squad halted, crouching low behind cover. Another soldier signaled with a flick of his hand, and a team of snipers repositioned, lining up perfect shots from hidden vantage points. The Zareth were outmaneuvered, despite their technological advantages. Retreat! Draxel barked into the communicator, his voice tinged with frustration. His order rang through the ranks, but it was already too late. The humans had them surrounded. Zareth warriors, who had never known fear, now faltered. They couldn't understand how the humans were able to coordinate so flawlessly without speaking. The silence was oppressive, unsettling, and it cut through the alien forces like a blade. As the Zareth strike team attempted to fall back, the humans moved in tandem, closing the gap with deadly precision. There were no battle cries, no shouts of triumph. The human soldiers fought like a single organism, communicating without words, anticipating every movement of their enemies. The Zareth were driven into a corner, their retreat routes cut off one by one, until they had no choice but to surrender or be annihilated. On the command ship, Draxel's breathing grew heavier. He had never seen anything like this. The humans' ability to communicate without words, to coordinate without technology, defied everything he knew. He had thought their reliance on speech was a weakness, but now he realized he had been wrong. The humans didn't need speech to fight. They had evolved beyond it. They're telepathic, Zyler whispered, fear creeping into his voice. They have to be. They're communicating through some mental link we can't detect. Draxel wasn't so sure. He had fought telepaths before, and this didn't feel the same. There was no psychic energy in the air, no telepathic resonance. What he sensed from the humans was more primal. Their coordination wasn't born of mental powers, but something else, something far more unsettling. It was as though they had learned to speak in silence, using the most subtle of gestures and expressions to convey volumes of information. "They're reading each other," Draxel said, his mind racing, not with thoughts, but with their bodies. Every glance, every movement, it's all communication. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The humans had mastered a form of communication so advanced, so precise, that it didn't require words at all. They didn't need the telepathic abilities of the Zareth. They had evolved a different kind of language, one based on trust, experience, and instinct, and it terrified him. Draxel stood in silence, watching as the last of his strike team was overwhelmed. His pride wanted to deny what he had witnessed, to believe that this was some anomaly, but deep down he knew the truth. Humanity's ability to communicate without words was a power that the Zareth could not understand, let alone defeat. "Commander," Xyler's voice trembled through the telepathic link. "What do we do now?" Draxel stared at the view screen, his fists trembling with rage. The humans hadn't just repelled his forces. They had exposed a fundamental flaw in the Zareth's understanding of power. The war would not be won with superior technology or psychic dominance. Against the humans, something more would be required. "We retreat," Draxel growled. "But this is far from over." Commander Draxel stared out the viewport of his flagship, his mind churning. The defeat at the outpost had been a humbling blow, but what haunted him more was the method of the humans' victory. They had communicated through means the Zareth could not comprehend. Through silence and subtlety, bypassing the very telepathic supremacy that had given his species dominance over countless worlds. His pride ached, but there was no time to wallow in the sting of failure. His forces needed a new strategy, and quickly. The human counterattack came before he had a chance to formulate one. Sensors aboard Draxel's ship blared as human fighter squadrons descended from the skies. Their sleek craft cut through the atmosphere like birds of prey, moving with the same eerie synchronization Draxel had witnessed in their ground forces. The fleet scrambled to respond, but again, the humans were always one step ahead, moving with a precision that defied traditional understanding. "Commander," Subcommander Xyler called out from his station, his voice trembling with anxiety. "They're flanking us. Their forces are already in position to intercept our escape vectors." Draxel clenched his jaw. How had the humans anticipated their movements so perfectly? Every time he ordered a shift in position, the human forces seemed to react instantly, adjusting their formations to cut off every possible route of retreat. He could sense the panic in his crew, their usual confidence eroded by the humans' unyielding, silent assault. "Prepare for battle," Draxel barked. His command sparked a flurry of movement across the bridge, but even as the Zareth ships engaged their shields and charged their weapons, it was clear they were already at a disadvantage. Below, on the surface, Captain James Peterson stood on a ridge overlooking the alien stronghold. His face was impassive, but his eyes scanned the battlefield with the practiced precision of a seasoned warrior. His team moved in sync around him. No words were necessary. They had trained for this, to fight as one without the need for spoken commands. Peterson raised his hand, signaling the ground units to advance. The humans flowed across the terrain, a coordinated wave of destruction. Artillery units, hidden in the hills, launched precise strikes at key Zareth defenses, while infantry squads moved swiftly and silently, slipping past enemy patrols with ease. Draxel's forces, despite their superior technology, found themselves cornered. His once mighty army, so confident in their psychic prowess, struggled to respond to the humans' silent and deadly efficiency. No matter how quickly Draxel relayed orders through his telepathic link, it was as though the humans knew what he was going to do before he did. The Zareth fleet in orbit fired volleys of plasma rounds toward the incoming human fighters, but the humans were relentless, weaving between the shots with unnatural precision. Their formations shifted fluidly, and every evasive maneuver brought them closer to the heart of the Zareth defenses. Inside his flagship, Draxel's frustration grew into outright fury. His telepathic commands rang through the minds of his subordinates, but the humans were implacable, their every move deliberate, unstoppable. He had never faced an enemy like this before, a force that didn't rely on technology or psychic power, but something far more elusive. "They're not using telepathy," Draxel hissed, finally acknowledging the truth. "They're predicting us." Xyler turned to him, confusion written across his face. "Predicting us, Commander? How is that possible?" Draxel shook his head. "It's not. It shouldn't be. And yet, here we are." Below, Captain Peterson and his team advanced toward the Zareth stronghold. His soldiers moved like shadows, slipping past enemy fortifications, knowing instinctively where each teammate would be without the need for radio communications. Every gesture, every glance, was enough to convey complex battle strategies, a level of coordination the Zareth could never have prepared for. Peterson raised his hand once more, signaling his forces to make the final push. With silent determination, they surged forward, overwhelming the last of the Zareth defenses. Draxel's troops, already rattled by their earlier defeats, were now in full retreat, unable to mount any cohesive resistance. Back on the flagship, Draxel watched in horror as his ground forces crumbled. His telepathic communications were drowned out by the overwhelming surge of panic flooding the minds of his soldiers. They were not just losing. They were being outmaneuvered at every turn, their every effort countered by an enemy that seemed to be inside their heads without ever touching their thoughts. "Commander, we must retreat," Xyler urged, his voice shaking. Draxel hesitated, his pride warring with the undeniable reality of their situation. His forces were being dismantled, and if he didn't act soon, there would be no fleet left to command. With a deep growl, he slammed his fist against the console. "Order the retreat," he said, his voice dripping with reluctant resignation. The Zareth ships began to pull away, engines roaring as they fled into the void. Draxel stood in silence, watching the humans from afar. He could still see the soldiers moving in perfect sync, their silent coordination mocking everything he had believed about the nature of communication and power. As his ship soared away from the battlefield, Draxel's mind churned with frustration and a gnawing fear. The humans had turned their weakness, speech, into a strength that the Zareth could not match. And though he had escaped, he knew this was only the beginning. Back on the surface, Captain James Peterson watched the alien ships retreat, the glow of their engines fading into the dark sky. He gave a brief nod to his second-in-command, and without a word, the humans began their next mission, moving forward into the silence of their victory.